Hey gang, Voltie here. Today I'm going to be bringing you the second last video in the Sideboard Cards You Should Own series for 7-Point Highlander. Today we're going to be going over the artifacts. These are by far the most common sideboard cards you'll see, just mathematically, because not everyone will be playing the same colours. However, a lot of them are incredibly high impact, and at the moment 2 artifacts in the sideboard are in the top 10 most played sideboard cards for the format. This is part of a series. There will be a link down below where you can check out the Building a Better Sideboard video, which was the start of this project. But otherwise, let's get right into it. So to start things off, we have Tormod's Crypt. This is a 0 mana artifact with tap, sack, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. This is the most basic form of graveyard hate you can have realistically. All of the other options will usually cost 1 mana or 2 mana or have some kind of upside or downside. If you need your deck to be as aggressive as possible and you need to be casting your cards as early as possible, that would be the primary reason to use Tormod's Crypt. The other use case is if you're playing Khan the Great Creator in your main deck and you want to have access to a bit of interaction for the graveyard on the turn that you play Khan, Tormod's Crypt would be the pick. Otherwise, it is realistically outclassed by a lot of the other graveyard hate sideboard options in colourless. However, it's something to keep in mind when deck building, mainly if you're doing the Khan the Great Creator thing. Next up, we have Welding Jar. This is another 0 mana artifact with Sacrifice Welding Jar, Regenerate Target Artifact. This usually sees mainboard play in Academy Robots decks, as well as some of the more mid-rangey artifact decks that are using different toolbox pieces. It's fallen off a little bit in terms of usage, just because not that many people are playing ways to blow up artifacts in the main board. The current primary use case would be Beseiju, who endures. However, in saying that, if you are playing a large amount of artifacts and you want to be able to hit Metalcraft for Mox Opal or have an extra blue mana for Tolarian Academy, Welding Jar is pretty good. It's a pretty safe card to put in your sideboard. Notably, if you are playing these artifact-based decks, you typically don't have as many sideboard options as other decks, and so cards like Welding Jar tend to make the cut. It's also something to keep in mind when playing against artifact decks that Welding Jar is a card that can exist in the 75 very realistically. So having instant speed interaction or ways to destroy artifacts that prevent them from being regenerated might be of some value. Next up, we have Cursed Scroll. This is a card that I would expect to see more of in 7-Point Highlander sideboards. Obviously, the fact that you can't have a handful of the same card, being a singleton format outside of basic lands, does reduce its viability. However, when it comes to actual potency in terms of repeatable damage that is difficult to interact with, Cursed Scroll is really hard to beat. If you activate Curse Scroll every turn while you have 1 card in hand, it's very, very easy to start racking up a lot of damage. I would expect the most that you would be seeing Curse Scroll in is in mono-red sideboards, where you just want a bit of extra resilience against life gain. Alternatively, it is also an Urza Saga target, which is something to keep in mind. At the moment, I think requiring someone to be playing Curse Scroll is a pretty big ask. Just because of the nature of the format. A lot of aggro decks and mid-range decks tend not to have the ability to run out of cards in hand. There's just a lot of, cantripping, and the initiative puts a basic in your hand. It's just a little bit hard to empty your hand for Curse Scroll these days. But in terms of its actual impact on a game state, it's really, really difficult to deal with that much damage over the course of a game, and it's quite difficult to interact with an artifact if your opponent is playing a red deck and you don't have a reason to be siding an artifact hate. Next up, we have Ghost Vacuum. This is a new card from Dustmourn. I picked this as one of the cards that I expected to see play in Highlander from Dustmourn, and it's definitely showing up a lot. Across the last 3 big events, it was in the top 10 sideboard cards across all decks. 2 instances. I think it was the first and third event. People are playing this card. It's really, really, really good. there are two basic classes of graveyard hate. There are chippers and there are nukers. So there's ways where you can eat some amount of cards from the graveyard over the course of a game. Things like Scavenging Ooze, things like Ghost Vacuum, for example, where usually the ability to blow up your opponent's whole graveyard isn't a priority. You're looking to stop reanimation effects, stop delirium, which is a nice, easy way to do that. And usually there is a reason that you want to be protecting your own graveyard, and some of the nukers don't have the ability to differentiate. Ghost Vacuum has a kicker of 6 mana, tap, reanimate everything that you exiled with Ghost Vacuum. That's a creature as a 1/1 spirit. This ability ends games very, very easily. Most creatures in 7-Point Highlander have some kind of on attack trigger, enters the battlefield trigger, leaves the battlefield trigger. It's very, very easy to just blow your opponent up when you crack your vacuum, whether that's, gaining the initiative 3 times and going all the way down to trap or something else. So realistically, if you haven't picked up a Ghost Vacuum, I would recommend it. It's one of the first sideboard cards I put into most decks I've been building recently. And if you have the ability to use your own graveyard, you should be prioritizing effects like Ghost Vacuum over things like Rest in Peace. Grafdigger's Cage is next. So for 1 mana, we have creature cards can't enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries, and players can't cast cards in graveyards or libraries. So this is an old school graveyard hate piece. It's fallen off a lot, and there's a couple of reasons. Notably, Grafdigger's Cage doesn't exile anything from the graveyard, so if they put something in their graveyard that they want to be bringing back or casting from their graveyard, and then they blow up your cage, they just already have the thing where it needs to be. So if it's a Flage or an Uro, they can blow up your cage, put Flage on the stack, and suddenly you're in the hole. The main reason that you would use something like Grafdigger's Cage, oddly enough, is for that first line of text. So creature cards can't enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries. From graveyards is pretty simple. It's a graveyard hate piece. But if you expect things like Collected Company, Court of Calling, Natural Order, Grafdigger's Cage actually has a use there. Alternatively, if you expect to be trying to use your own graveyard at some point, and you'll have a way to get rid of your Grafdigger's Cage based off the nature of your combo deck, that might be a reason to play it, but otherwise, in a typical sense, you should be playing Ghost Vacuum. Next up is Pithing Needle. This is a very particular case of if you really, really need this effect, it's fine. If you're just putting it in your sideboard for some ambiguous card that you plan on naming, you shouldn't be playing it. So Pithing Needle is a 1 mana artifact. When it comes into play, you choose a card name, and activated abilities with the name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So if you are in colors that don't have the ability to interact with certain permanent types very well, this is mostly going to come up with like artifacts and enchantments and planeswalkers, then Pithing Needle might be an answer to something specific. However, you do also need to be in a dedicated metagame where this is viable. So if people are playing things like Time Vault, this is fine. However, if people are playing things like LED and Black Lotus, this isn't going to do anything. So keep that in mind. Pithing Needle, unlike all the other constructed formats, Pithing Needle is a lot worse here because of the singleton format. Both because you won't hit 4 copies of your opponent's card, and also they're less likely to draw the card that you're trying to name. So it really has to be something that people are doing, like the One Ring or Time Vault, where you expect them to be doing it every game, and for some reason you can't interact with that permanent type via normal means. Relic of Progenitus is next. This is another chipper, however it does have a nuke stapled to it. So for a 1 mana artifact, you can tap to make target player exile a card from their graveyard, and then for 1 mana you can exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. If you don't care about your own graveyard, Relic is fine, because having the ability to nuke all graveyards while also being able to chip away at their graveyard in the meantime does have merit. A lot of the other nukers like Soul Guide Lantern and Nihil Spellbomb don't have the ability to eat away at the graveyard slowly. Notably, Relic of Progenitus, unlike Ghost Vacuum, can't choose what you're eating from the graveyard. You're simply eating a card. So if your opponents are trying to delve, and they're using their graveyard in that way, this is fine. If they're trying to hit Delirium, they can simply exile anything they have a duplicate of. If they have a Tarmogoyf in play, they can exile something that you have, so that the Tarmogoyf stays the same size. So Relic is a lot worse than it used to be, however it is somewhat viable of a sideboard option. Retrofitter Foundry. This is actually a really sweet card that I think should be appearing in way more sideboards. If you're playing an Urza Saga deck, and you want a generic artifact to get either in your main deck or in your sideboard that does something, Retrofitter Foundry is really, really good. If you stick it against a slow, mid-rangey control deck, it can simply do too much before they blow it up. And if you get to a point where you can start making Thopters regularly, or you sack the Thopters to make 4/4s while blocking, you can actually just overwhelm your opponent. If you have a way to abuse the extra artifacts like Tolarian Academy, this ramps up really quickly. Retrofitter Foundry, unlike a lot of these other artifacts that can make guys, does have the ability to untap itself. It is expensive, but if you are generating lots of mana, you can actually start really churning through the abilities and putting your opponent under pressure. Shadow Spear is next. So for a 1 mana equipment, you get +1/+1 trample and lifelink. It has an equip of 2, and it makes your opponent's permanents lose hexproof and indestructible for 1 mana. The second line of text is very, very close to flavor text. It does come up sometimes. I think I've activated Shadow Spear in that sense maybe once in my life. Realistically, you're playing Shadow Spear if you have access to Stoneforge or Urza Saga, and you're in a metagame where aggressive decks exist but are not super popular. So you don't want to put it in the main deck because it's a blank against combo decks, but you do want to have access to it when racing. That's the primary use case for Shadow Spear, not too much to say there. Next up is Silent Gravestone. This is actually a super weird card, and it was a tech option in Legacy Dredge for a while. So for a 1 mana artifact, you get cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities, and for 4 mana, tap, exile it and all cards from all graveyards to draw a card. So for 5 mana, you can blow up all the graveyards and draw a card, which is a terrible rate. But the primary purpose of Silent Gravestone is to protect your graveyard. It is not to stop what your opponent is doing to their own graveyard. It does do that. So if they cast Reanimate targeting their Genericent, that'll be an illegal play under Silent Gravestone. But if you're using your graveyard in a way that goes around Silent Gravestone, you can actually dodge things like Ghost Vacuum, Unlicensed Hearse, which we'll get to, Deathrite Shaman, and you can protect those resources while also preventing your opponent from abusing their own graveyard, assuming that those ways work with Silent Gravestone. So the most obvious use case for this is probably Flage and Uro and the other Titans. If you have a Flage in your graveyard, Silent Gravestone does not stop you from putting it on the stack. However, if you have a Flage in your graveyard, your opponent can't use Deathrite Shaman to eat your Flage while Gravestone is in play. Now, this is a very uncommon play pattern. However, if you have a lot of ways to use your graveyard in this manner, and you want to protect it from graveyard hate, Silent Gravestone is actually really, really powerful in those spots. Next up is Soul Guide Lantern. This has mostly outclassed things like Grafdigger's Cage and Relic of Progenitus as a way to nuke graveyards. I believe the only competition in the Soul Guide Lantern spot is Nihil Spellbomb, and only if you're in black. So for a 1 mana artifact, you get ETB, tag something in a graveyard, and then tap, sack it, exile each opponent's graveyard, and then 1 mana tap, sack it, draw a card. It's going to be very unlikely that you actually sacrifice it to draw a card, but it is notable upside, because Nihil Spellbomb has a similar effect. However, Nihil gets to tag the graveyard on the way out. Soul Guide Lantern as a way to hit one thing and then threaten the rest of their graveyard is very powerful, and that's why it's overtaken cards like Relic and Tormod's Crypt and Grafdigger's Cage. However, I do believe pound for pound it is probably a little bit worse than Ghost Vacuum if you have a critical mass of ways to interact with the graveyard. If you only really have one or two ways, and this is going to be one of them, Soul Guide's fine. Soul Guide's a very good card, has enough upside, and you should just play it. Next up we have Stone of Eric. So for 1 mana we have a legendary artifact. Whenever a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. And then for 2 mana, tap sack, exile target player's graveyard, draw a card. So it combines a lot of the different aspects of artifact graveyard hate cards. Notably, it has very real upside on the first line of text. If your opponent flashes in a Hulk, it will not go to the graveyard because it'll be exiled. If your opponent plays a Flage to kill your guy, it will go to exile. If your opponent does some kind of evoke shenanigans like Solitude and then plans on reanimating it, it'll get exiled. So it's very real upside, and as long as you're okay with holding up 2 mana rather than 1 mana in order to nuke a graveyard in response to a threat, that's pretty reasonable. However, I think Stone of Eric would usually be your second or third artifact hate piece in your sideboard, because that first line of text equates to a fair amount, but the second line of text is actually a lot worse than it looks. So whether or not you play Stone really depends on your deck composition. If you're playing a lot at instant speed and holding up 2 mana isn't too bad, then maybe you can play Stone. If you have a lot of ways to kill creatures but very few to exile them, so if you're playing black base removal instead of white, for example, then maybe Stone is good enough. Next up we have Vexing Bauble. This is another Urza Saga target that you can play. You can also just play it in any deck. So for 1 mana, we have an artifact with a static ability of whenever a player casts a spell, no mana was spent to cast it, it gets countered, and then for 1 mana tap sack, draw a card. So it's kind of like a Chalice of the Void for 0, but different enough that it has quite a lot more meaningful text, despite what it might seem. If your opponent evokes any of the pitch elementals, they get countered. If your opponent casts Force of Will, that gets countered. If they cast Gush, that gets countered. This card's really, really good at stopping unfair spells. However, if you're playing a 7-point Highlander deck, the odds that your deck doesn't have ways to cast spells for free is really, really low. And so Vexing Bauble is almost always going to hit both of you over the course of a game, and it's just a matter of mitigating how much it's hitting you versus how much it's hitting them. I think more decks should have this in the sideboard, but it really depends on the metagame as well. If you're playing against combo decks that will get hit by Bauble, like LED for example, then this has text. If you're playing against things like Academy, Wheels, and One Ring, then this is going to hit some of the 0 drops and then you'll still die. So it's something to consider there, but otherwise, card's pretty powerful in terms of a pound-for-pound evaluation. Next up, we have Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So this is a really weird addition to the Artifact Graveyard Hate package. It got printed back in Thrones of Eldraine, and in Wilds, rather. And this card's really good, but it is worse than the other options. And that's why you don't see much of Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So to run it down, we have a 2-mana artifact. You can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. This is just a static ability, but the main reason it comes up is for the other lines of text. Creatures you control with 1/1 counters on them have all activate abilities of all creature cards exiled with Soul Cauldron, and tap, exile a card from any graveyard. When a creature card is exiled, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So if you exile something from the graveyard, you can give that activated ability to one of your creatures. And if that's Mother of Runes or Giver of Runes, that's really powerful. For the most part, you're going to be spending 2 mana to have an incidental graveyard hate piece that over the course of a long game will actually help you outsize your opponent's creatures with similar value creatures. That's the primary use case of Soul Cauldron, And because that's the main use case, it's not actually very good, because a lot of the other sideboard options are just more impactful. However, it did see a lot of play when it first got printed, and I think it's probably due for a comeback at some point soon. Next up we have Cursed Totem. So for a 2-mana artifact, activated abilities of creatures can't be activated. This is a flat ability, and it does not care about mana abilities, and this is very, very crucial to this card's playability. Cursed Totem hits every mana dork. It hits things like Mother of Runes, it hits things like Deathrite Shaman, it even hits things like Lion Sash and Scavenging Ooze. This card is really, really powerful and really, really mediocre. If you're playing any amount of creatures in your own deck, there is a decent chance that some of them have activated abilities. Cursed Totem will turn those off. If you aren't playing creatures, you're probably playing a fair amount of removal spells. Cursed Totem will still turn off the mana dorks and slow your opponent's acceleration down. It'll turn off a Mother of Runes so you can point and click around it. It'll stop things like Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista, Steel Overseer. It is very, very powerful, but there are a lot of decks that Cursed Totem does absolutely nothing against. Any creatureless combo deck, you have one less sideboard card. Reanimator, you have one less sideboard card. A lot of the Nadu decks will have some backup way to trigger Nadu, like Shuko, for example, that will go around Cursed Totem. So it's very, very powerful in the right situation, and if your metagame calls for it, it is better to have it on hand than not, especially if you have ways to tutor for it, like Whir of Invention, for example. But on the whole, the card is a little bit too medium. Damping Sphere is next. This is Blood Moon at Home, stapled to some other cards. So for a 2-mana artifact, we have one line of text that hates lands. So if a land is tapped for 2 or more mana, it produces colorless instead. So single colorless instead of any of the other mana they make. And each spell a player casts costs 1 more to cast for each other spell they cast that turn. So on every single spell you play during a turn, there is a tax on the next spell. And if your land taps for any amount of mana that is more than 1, it will turn that off. It's fine. It's very potent in a lot of situations. However, realistically, if you're getting around the land ability by making sure that all your lands just tap for 1 and you're not using Academy or Workshop or Ancient Tomb or Gaia's Cradle, that's fine. But if you're doing that, you're still probably going to be wanting to cast more than 1 spell a turn, and that tax is a little bit meaningful. On top of that, if you aren't playing lands that make lots of mana, the odds that you have access to Blood Moon or Harbinger of the Seas is pretty high, and you should just be playing those cards instead. If you're unable to cast them or you want an extra piece of hate, Damping Sphere is fine. It's a very reasonable card to put in your sideboard. However, it looks a lot better on paper than it actually plays out, so grain of salt. Next up we have Defense Grid. This is a classic combo sideboard card. For a 2-mana artifact, each spell costs 3 more to cast except during its controller's turn. Basically, every single spell you want to cast in your opponent's turn costs 3 more, and every counter spell they want to cast in your turn costs 3 more. The typical play pattern is you'll play Defense Grid on 2. If they have a counter spell, they have to counter it, otherwise they're never countering anything again. If they don't have a counter spell, if you protect it with a Duress or a Thoughtseize, all of their counter spells are off unless they can blow Defense Grid up. And this then gives you a very strict window where Defense Grid is up, I plan on killing my opponent, this is the time to do it. It's really powerful, it's really strong. If you play a lot of combo decks, I would recommend picking one up. It's just a very, very good all-around sideboard card. Next up is Mazemind Tome. This card's a bit too cute and you shouldn't really go pick one up, but if you have one from Standard and it's rotated out, you can play it in 7-point Highlander. It's pretty reasonable. For a 2-mana artifact, you can tap, it gets a counter, and then you scry one. For 2 mana tap, it gets a counter and you draw a card, and then when it hits 4 counters, you gain 4 life, and it blows up. The typical use case of Maze Mind Tome is play it, activate to scry to effect a draw, and then from then on, you're essentially waiting until you can spend all of the mana to get a full fresh hand's worth out of your Maze Mind Tome, and gaining a little bit of life to offset the amount of dirtling you've been doing. If you're playing some kind of draw-go control deck, this is actually a really powerful effect. It's also incredible in mirrors. However, do be mindful that it is very slow, and if your opponent is trying to kill you, trying to draw cards out of your Maze Mind Tome is probably not going to be good enough. You'll probably just be playing it, scrying a bunch, gaining 4 life, and getting maybe 1 or 2 cards to replace it. Next up is Null Rod. This is the big one. Null Rod, players cannot play any artifact abilities requiring an activation cost. That's it. But it doesn't do anything. No, it does nothing. Null Rod is the classic sideboard card that people play. If you have access to green, you can play Collector Roof. If you have access to white, you can play Stony Silence. If you don't have access to those, you can play Null Rod. I'll give you a hint, depending on your metagame, this may not be true, but if you have access to green or white, you should play Null Rod as well. If you're playing 8 points, you can't play it, it's on the reserve list, but having 2 of this effect is a lot better than having 1 of it, and so if you have access to green and white, you can leave the Null Rod at home, but if you have access to green or white, play Oof or Stony Silence plus Null Rod. Just do it, trust me, it's really, really good. Next up we have Phyrexian Revoker. This is very similar to Pithing Needle, however it stops mana abilities, but it can't name lands. So Pithing Needle can stop things like Bazaar of Baghdad, Caracas' bounce effect. Phyrexian Revoker can stop mana abilities, which means you can name things like Mana Dorks, you can name things like Sol Ring and Mana Crypt. If you're playing some kind of creature combo deck and you have the ability to search for specific creatures with a toolbox package like Court of Calling or Eladamri's Call, there are going to be some metagames where Phyrexian Revoker is a fine card to play in your sideboard. All of the other Pithing Needle effects like Sorcerer's Spyglass aren't creatures. Phyrexian Revoker is basically the only one. So if you have activated abilities that you want to hit, Phyrexian Revoker is really good. That's basically the end of it. The fact that it has a real body, I mean it's a Goblin Piker, but it does attack and block, is reasonable upside compared to something like Pithing Needle. Next up is Reckoner Bankbuster. This is another standard all-star which actually got banned in standard, and it's very similar to Maze Mind Tome. For a 2 mana vehicle, you get a 4/4 with 3 charge counters on it. For 2 mana, you remove a counter and draw a card, and then once you've eaten all the counters, you get a guy, you get a treasure token, and the guy can crew the vehicle. Bankbuster is one of the better vehicles that you can be playing in your sideboard, and the main reason to play vehicles in your sideboard is if you're a creature deck that doesn't have much of an ability to interact on the stack. So if your opponent is playing things like Brotherhood's End or Supreme Verdict or Terminus, vehicles are really good as a way to catch up on board after they've wrathed you. You can immediately play a creature, you can crew the vehicle, it'll be able to attack, and you can keep the pressure going. Bankbuster on top of that does draw you cards. If you flood out, you can fix that by getting some extra resources. And then it has, you know, a non-zero amount of flavor text in terms of once you pop it. But for the most part, it's a really big, chunky vehicle that you can use to attack after rats that can also act as a draw engine. Soulless Jailer is next. Permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. This is very similar to Grafdigger's Cage, except it's on a stick. However, the stick is an 0/4, so it's not a real stick in terms of actually attacking. It does block, but that's it. Soulless Jailer is fine to put in your sideboard with the same disclaimer as Phyrexian Revoker of if you can tutor for this and you want the effect, you can put it in your sideboard and that's fine. Other than that, I would probably play other graveyard hate effects before Soulless Jailer. But if you have meaningful uses out of its artifact creature body, like things like Steel Overseer or Eladamri's Call, then it's a worthwhile thing to own for $1. Next up is Sphere of Resistance. This is a very, very common sideboard card in Legacy, out of lands. It's a very common mainboard card in Vintage before it got restricted. 2 mana, all spells cost 1 more to play. That's it. It's like a Thalia, but for everything. It's just really, really good if you expect to have more mana, or you expect your opponent's cards to cost less, and for them to be casting them at a higher velocity. If you spend your turn on average casting 3 cantrips, Sphere of Resistance adds 3 mana. If your deck spends that 3 mana on one spell, Sphere of Resistance adds 1 mana. So instead of paying 6 mana, you spend 4 mana. That's the basic use case. It slows people down, it slows combo decks down. It's pretty bad against some aggressive decks, but it really depends on your ability to power it out early and your ability to make use of all of your mana every turn. Thorn of Amethyst is next. 2 mana artifact, non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. It's Thalia. If you want Thalia, you can play Thalia. If you're not in white and you want Thalia, you can play Thorn of Amethyst. Simple as that, really. There are very few decks, I would say, in the metagame that want access to 2 Thalias. I would argue that most don't even want the first one. However, if you do want access to both, or you don't have white, or you want the effect to not be on a creature, to protect it from removal, Thorn is there for you. Good card. Next up is Torpor Orb. This is very similar to Curse Totem in terms of its hosing effect. It just works a little differently. So for a 2 mana artifact, creatures don't trigger anything when they come into play. This notably doesn't only list their own ETB triggers. So if you have some kind of trigger that happens whenever a creature comes into play, it will not work. The simplest example of this is Thalia's Lieutenant. When you play it, it won't have a trigger to put a counter on all your humans, but when you play another human, it also won't get a counter, because that's still causing an ability to trigger. The most common use case for Torpor Orb is to beat Thassa's Oracle, because that is an enters the battlefield trigger. If you don't have the ability to interact with Thassa's Oracle on the stack, then this is the main reason that you would play Torpor Orb. There are other decks that would want to play this. If you don't plan on introducing the initiative, but you're not very good at taking it, Torpor Orb's pretty good. It technically comes down earlier than White Plume, which is the cheapest initiative creature, and that way you can just exclude those mechanics from the game. Jit. Jit is on this list because at the moment, Jit is a really bad mainboard card, but we'll get to that. If you don't know what Jit does, we'll go through it top to bottom. For a 2 mana equipment, you get 3 abilities that you get access to whenever you have charge counters. So for 2 mana, you get the equipment. For 2 mana, you can equip Jit to the creature. Whenever that creature does any amount of combat damage, you get 2 counters on Jit. This is very important. If you attack with a grizzly bear that has a Jit on it, and your opponent blocks with their grizzly bear, you get 2 counters on your Jit after both creatures have died, and you can use those counters in one of 3 ways. You can buff the equipped creature, not any creature, only the equipped creature, by +2/+2. You can give any creature -1/-1, or you can gain 2 life. This is by far one of the strongest limited cards of all time. It is by far one of the strongest equipment of all time. It is 2024, and this card is very, very mediocre now. And it hurts me so much to say that. However, if you have access to Stoneforge Mystic, and you have access to 2 to 3 good mainboard equipment, like Pre-War Formalware, Lion Sash, and Skull Clamp or something, Jit is a very reasonable sideboard card to play for creature matchups. It's also a very potent sideboard effect for decks that do not have Stoneforge Mystic as well. If you're playing a Jund mirror, and you're both playing things like Tarmogoyf and Baragoyf and Pyrogoyf and Minskimbu, if one person has a Jit, they will win that game. They will simply outclass their opponent's creatures inside of combat, gain too much life, make blocks too impossible, and you'll eventually win the game. Those are the primary use cases. I think it's fallen off. I think it's going to keep falling off. However, at $7, Jit's kind of a steal these days. Next up we have Unlicensed Hearst. This is the other card that was in the top 10 most played sideboard cards from the last couple of events. For 2 mana you get a vehicle with tap, exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, so you can't tag 1 in each. And then it has power and toughness to each card exiled by it with crew 2. Unlicensed Hearst is really, really, really good. The ability to eat 2 cards at a time can't be understated. Being able to outpace things like Thought Scour and Mental Note is really difficult when your chip artifacts only hit 1 card at a time. Hearst does 2 at a time for free. Hearst has the second mode, which is I have gobbled up your whole graveyard, we have traded resources, neither of us have very few removal spells left in our deck. I'm going to attack you with a 10-10 and hope you just die. And none of the other artifact graveyard cards can do that. I would argue that none of the other graveyard hate cards can do that. Unlicensed Hearst can actually kill people. And that's something that is worth a lot. And if you have any ability to crew it, if you have any ability to use your own graveyard and you need something to chip at your opponent's graveyard, but you don't want Rest in Peace, play Unlicensed Hearst. It's as simple as that. Next up we have Void Mirror. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. This card's really mediocre, but there are metagames where you want it. If you expect your opponent to be using Mishra's Workshop mana, Void Mirror is really good. The issue is it doesn't hit Tolarian Academy mana, and those decks will usually be playing both of those. It does hit 0 drops, which is a notable upside of this. If your opponent plays a free spell, Void Mirror will hit it, on top of if they only spend colorless mana to cast it. However, most of the decks that have the ability to make a meaningful amount of colorless mana also have the ability to make colored mana. So, grain of salt, word of caution. Card itself, when it's in play, will usually do something. Whether or not that's what you want really depends on your deck and your expected metagame, but I wanted to list it here for completion. Next up we have a nice pair, and we'll go through them together. We have Winter Moon, which is a new version of Winter Orb. So Winter Orb, 2 mana artifact. Players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap phases. It doesn't say it on here, but this only works if Winter Orb is untapped. So if your opponent has the ability to tap your Winter Orb, they'll be able to untap all their lands. Very rarely comes up, not 0. I think the most obvious use case is Urza Lord High Artificer. You can have Winter Orb untapped in your turn, so your opponent can only tap 1 land per turn. And then in their end step, you tap Winter Orb to make blue so that you can untap all your lands. Winter Moon, 2 mana artifact. Players can only untap more than 1 non-basic land during their untap step, and it does not have the tap untap clause because it's a newer templated artifact and we don't really do that anymore. These cards are fine if you have the ability to put pressure on your opponent, and having them cast multiple cards per turn is something that's scary to you and you plan on operating off very few lands, whether that's because you have Mana Dorks or Gaia's Cradle or Tolarian Academy. These cards are really, really good. Whether or not you play them is entirely context dependent. However, I think picking up a Winter Moon, if you're playing an 8-point deck with lots of basics, is very reasonable. Winter Orb's like a 10er at the moment. And if you like the effect of Tangle Wire, for example, which we'll get to, Winter Orb is a stack space, and sometimes people are into that. Next up, we have Crucible of Worlds. we have Ramming Up Excavator and Walk-in Closet as other ways to play lands from your graveyard. Crucible is, to my knowledge, the OG. For a 3-mana artifact, you can play lands from your graveyard. This is relatively innocuous, but when you factor in things like Fast Bond, you get the ability to do some wacky combos where you go infinite. However, there is a fair use case for Crucible. If you're playing some kind of balanced control deck, Crucible is really good. If you have Crucible in play and you can blow up all of the lands with Armageddon, for example, you can start playing extra lands every turn, and your opponent will have to actually naturally draw their lands. If you expect to control mirrors, Crucible is a reasonable way to get ahead because you can play lands out of your graveyard instead of out of your hand. You can turn the ones in your hand into real cards with things like Brainstorm and Jace the Mind Sculptor. And the main reason that Crucible will still see play going into the future is because it's colorless. And Ramming Up Excavator and Walk-in Closet are both green. And so if you don't own a Crucible and you've been thinking about buying one, by all means, it's going to see play going well into the future until they print a new version that does it better. Next up we have Palantir of Orthanc. This card is really difficult to decipher, but I'll try to explain it best I can. For a 3-mana artifact, you get an artifact that has an end step trigger every turn. It'll get a counter, that happens every time, and then you'll scry 2. You don't scry X, where X is the number of counters, you always scry 2. Then your opponent can choose for you to draw a card, or mill X, where X is the number of counters on it, and take damage equal to the mana value of those cards. The most common play pattern of Palantir is that you play it, end stepper gets a counter, you scry 2, your opponent says mill, and they take 3 to 5 damage. The next turn, you'll scry 2, you'll have 2 counters on it, and if they're on a healthy enough life total, they'll say mill, take some amount of damage, and move on. At some point, their life total will be low enough that they'll make you draw a card every turn. And what this will turn into is a 3-mana artifact at the beginning of your end step, scry 2, and then draw a card. If that's something you're in the market for, which is a lot of decks, Palantir is the best at it. The timing of the card draw is worse than something like Phyrexian Arena, where you'll be able to draw it and play it that turn, but the scry 2 is valuable. The fact that your opponent is going to be pretty hard-pressed to interact with an artifact, the fact that it doesn't do you any damage, like some of the other ways to draw extra cards. Palantir is good. It's pretty simple. It looks really ominous in terms of its text. It's really confusing. The first couple of times you play it, you'll get what's going on. Next up, I put Sophie. This is a pet card, and I think more people should play this card. For a 3-mana equipment with 2 to equip, the equipped creature gets +2/+2, pro red and pro blue, and when it hits them, you can deal 2 damage to anything and draw a card. If you're looking for some kind of equipment for your sideboard for control matchups, Sophie's really, really good. It's very expensive, and you probably need some way to get past the fact that it costs so much to play and equip. Probably Mana Docs, maybe Gaia's Cradle. But if you can start connecting with Sophie, it'll win the game. And it's kind of as simple as that. The classic Death and Taxes, which is a white mid-range deck, Equipment Suite had a Jit and a Sophie. The Jit was for the creature matchups, the Sophie was for the non-creature matchups. And I think people should still be looking at playing this card when possible. There's also a couple of other swords that are viable, like Light and Shadow, but I think out of the 10 or 15, however many they made, this is by far the best one. Next up is Tanglewire. I briefly mentioned this. This card is really, really good, and you really, really need to be in the market for its effect to actually play it. For 3 mana, you get an artifact with Fading 4. We'll get into that. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they tap an untapped artifact, creature, or land for each counter on it. So when you play Tanglewire, it comes into play with 4 counters, and in their turn, they have to tap 4 things. Usually, this will be all of their lands and their one creature. Depending on how the game state is going, depending on when you played the Tanglewire, sometimes they'll have to choose between casting spells for the turn or having creatures to attack you or having creatures to block you. Over time, this effect will be lessened. So on the second turn that it gets around to them, they'll have an extra land in play, presumably, and they'll be tapping one less thing. So Tanglewire is really, really good. The earlier you get it in play, the less it impacts your side of the board, and the more it impacts their side of the board. So as long as you can keep attacking, keep putting pressure on, and hopefully your opponent can't do anything meaningful, Tanglewire is pretty good. To get into fading, at the beginning of your upkeep it loses a counter, and so as the fading counter ticks down, Tanglewire gets less impressive. But notably, there are two triggers which happen at the beginning of your upkeep, which is removing a counter and tapping permanents. If you stack the triggers right, you tap one less thing than your opponent would tap, and you can tap Tanglewire. This is very important. When you're actually evaluating the effect of Tanglewire, it's effectively 3 mana, my opponent taps 4 things, and then in my turn I tap 2 things. Then in their turn they tap 3 things, and I tap 1 thing. Because in the scenario, we're counting Tanglewire as a thing to tap, but it doesn't actually do anything. You're not losing a mana or a creature by tapping your Tanglewire. In terms of how to stack the triggers on Moto, that's something you can find out if you play this card. It's a fun little learning experience for everyone. Next up we have 3-ball, Trinisphere. 3 mana artifact. As long as it's untapped, there's that templating again. Each spell that would cost less than 3 mana to cast costs 3 mana to cast. That's it. It's really, really good if your opponent is casting 1-drops and 0-drops. It's really, really good if you can play it on turn 1 with Mishra's Workshop. It's really, really good if you are playing a deck full of 2 and 3-drops and your opponent is playing a deck full of 1 and 2-drops. That's kind of it. It's a bit of cardboard that will slow the game down, and as long as it's slowing the game down in your favor, there might be a reason to play Trinisphere. In terms of how the card works, you can ask a judge if you'd like, but the very basic rule of thumb is that if it costs less than 3, it costs 3. If it has cost reduction, that happens before Trinisphere. If it has cost additives, that happens before Trinisphere. 3-ball happens last, and always happens. Easiest way to remember it. I know there are some fringe cases where people can play spells underneath Trinisphere. I'm a bit rusty on that side of things, so I'm not entirely sure what there are. But realistically, it'll almost always get the job done. Next up we have Canoptek Scarab Swarm. This is actually another card I pinched off the Death and Taxes players in Legacy. For 4 mana, we get a 1/1 flying artifact creature insect. When it comes into play, nuke a graveyard. For each artifact or land exiled, make a 1/1. This card is really, really powerful. If you've been nipping away at the graveyard, it's going to have less of an impact. However, if you have the ability to cheat this into play, or you have the ability to flicker this and do it multiple times, it's almost always going to give you a lot of cardboard for 4 mana. So when you think about each artifact, that's probably not going to have too much impact. People do play things like baubles, but it hits each land as well. So every single time your opponent has fetched this game, you get an insect. Every single time they've surveilled a land into their graveyard, you get an insect. It's fine. It's pretty good. I don't see it show up. I think this card is really good. I put it into a bunch of sideboards, but I never draw it, so I don't actually know if it's good enough in this format. But I think it's cool. Next up we have Coercive Portal. This is a commander printing or a conspiracy printing originally. And it's a really weird card, so we'll go into it. For 4 mana, you get an artifact with Will of the Council, which is a multiplayer mechanic that was not designed for 1v1 play. So the amount of text it has looks really confusing, but we'll go through that. At the beginning of your upkeep, starting with you, each player votes for Carnage or Homage. If Carnage gets more votes, which in this case is 2-0, because there's only 2 players, you sacrifice it and blow up all non-land permanents. If Homage gets more votes or the vote is tied, draw a card. It's a lot of words. This card draws you a card every turn. That's it. In order for the Wrath effect to happen, you have to both agree that a Wrath is best in this position, which is almost never going to happen in a one-on-one game. Someone is always going to be winning, and that person is not going to vote for Carnage, so it's just 4 mana, draw a card every turn. The reason I have it listed on here, while Palantir is also on here, is that Coercive Portal draws the card at a much more convenient time. It draws the card at the beginning of your upkeep, where Palantir draws it at your end step, so you can play the card immediately. If the difference between 3 and 4 mana is relatively negligible, Coercive Portal is pretty good. If you're playing both, Coercive Portal is pretty good. Otherwise, it's kind of just there. I don't know how many decks I've made that have Coercive Portal in them, but it's not 0. Card's really sweet. But yeah, in terms of its text, just think of it as upkeep, draw a card. Way easier. Oh boy, next up we have Helm of Obedience. This card is a reader, and you probably don't need the whole text, but we'll go through it. For 4 mana, you get an artifact. It has X, tap. Put the top card of target opponent's library into their graveyard. Continue doing this until you have put X cards or a creature card into that graveyard, whichever occurs first. If the last card put into the graveyard is a creature card, bury Helm of Obedience, and then put the creature in a play under your control. X can't be 0. So if you play Helm of Obedience and you have a bunch of mana, you can try and flip one of your opponent's creatures and get it into play and blow up your Helm. This is not the most common use case. Helm of Obedience is used when your opponent does not have a graveyard. If you activate Helm of Obedience and target your opponent, and there is any effect in play that stops cards from going into their graveyard, like Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void, they deck, and then they die in their draw step. If you view the card as that, and you have the ability to make that play, and you want to sideboard Duke as a way to win the game without needing combat, with limited permanents going onto the stack, Helm's really, really good. It's a very common sideboard strategy for a lot of like Stumpy decks in Legacy and Vintage. If you have the ability to do that, it's pretty cool. Don't activate this and don't put it in your deck if you plan on just trying to like rip a creature. It's just not worth it. Lastly, we have Batterskull. This has in brackets Cauldron Complete as well. Batterskull is a really big living weapon equipment, which basically means when it comes into play, you get an idiot, and that idiot is equipped to the Batterskull. So if you spend 5 mana, you get a 4/4 with Vigilance and Lifelink, and then you can spend another 5 mana to give those stats to something else, and you can spend 3 mana to bounce into your hand. If you're playing Stoneforge Mystic, and you have reasonable ways to get to 5 mana, and you want something for the aggro and mid-range matchups, Batterskull's okay. That's really what it's there for. Realistically, if you're willing to play something like Batterskull in conjunction with Pre-War Formalware, which is by far better, you can play it in the main deck, but having an extra thing in your sideboard to go over the top does have value, and that's why I've listed it here. So that is everything for the Artifact sideboard cards. If you have any comments, feel free to put them down below, but otherwise the link to this sideboard sheet will be in the comments, will be in the description as well. And feel free to join me next time for the land sideboard cards, which will be the end of the series. This video was possible thanks to my lovely patrons and donors. If you'd like to see your name up here on screen, feel free to click on the link below to join on the Patreon. If you are watching this video on YouTube, please like and subscribe. I know that you probably hear that a lot from everyone, but it really does help us out. Content creators, we're doing this for pennies, if not nothing. And and subscribing and showing that, you know, you care and you want to watch the videos and you want to be notified of them really does help us out. So please consider it. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. But otherwise, that's from me. Voltie out.